The judge's voice was flat when she said the word custodian, and it took me a full 3 seconds to understand that she meant someone else was about to control my family's house. I sat very straight in the hard courtroom chair, my hands folded so tightly my knuckles had gone white, and I told myself that whoever it was, I could work with them for 90 days. 90 days was nothing. 90 days was a season. I had survived worse seasons than that. I had survived the season my mother died. I had survived the 8 months I spent watching my grandmother forget my name, and then remember it again. Over and over. Like a tide that couldn't decide whether to come in. Then the judge said the name Vera Halden, and I felt the floor tilt under me, even though I was sitting down. Across the aisle, in the row reserved for petitioners and their counsel, Vera did not react at all. She sat with her spine straight, and her hands loosely folded over a leather portfolio, wearing a charcoal suit that looked tailored specifically to discourage argument. Her dark hair was pulled back, not a strand out of place, and her expression was the same calm, unreadable expression she'd worn 6 years earlier when she stood in a different courtroom and stopped me from selling 40 acres of my own land to pay for my grandmother's care. I had spent 6 years hoping I would never have to look at that face again, and here it was, 3 feet closer than the last time, and infuriatingly no less striking for the years between us. The judge explained the terms in dry, procedural language while my ears rang. Because of what she called material evidence of financial irregularity and possible fraud against the estate, the court was appointing an independent custodian to oversee all major financial and preservation decisions concerning Bellamy House for a period of 90 days. The Halden Preservation Trust would assume that role. I remained, the judge said, the estate's legal presumptive heir. I retained my personal rights, my privacy, my freedom of movement, my right to live my own life exactly as I chose. What I did not retain, for the next 3 months, was any authority to sell, mortgage, alter, or dispose of anything belonging to my grandmother's house, without Vera Halden's signature beside my own. Every contract, every repair invoice, every decision about what stayed and what went, would now require her approval. I did not hear the rest. I was too busy staring at the woman who had once told a courtroom that I could not be trusted to make decisions about my own inheritance, and who apparently still believed it, or believed it enough to accept a court's invitation to prove it again. When the hearing ended, I did not wait for my lawyer to finish gathering his papers into his battered leather case. I walked straight into the marble corridor outside the courtroom, my heels sharp against the stone, and Vera was already there, checking something on her phone as though the last 10 minutes had been an ordinary Tuesday, instead of the day my life folded in half. "You waited 6 years to finish the job," I said. "Congratulations." She looked up. Her eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of the lake in February, and they moved over my face the way they always had, cataloging rather than admiring, filing away details for later use, the way she filed away every clause in every contract she'd ever read. "I didn't ask for this appointment, Iris." "You never ask. You just show up with an injunction or a court order and ruin things efficiently, and then tell me it was for my own good. I filed a preservation petition 6 years ago because a predatory developer was about to clear-cut protected woodland under the cover of a distress sale. I was right about that, and you know it." "You were right," I said, my voice climbing, despite my best efforts to keep it level, and I still had to sell my mother's jewelry to pay for chemotherapy, because the money I would have gotten from that land never came. Being right didn't put food on the table, Vera. It just made you feel virtuous while I lost things I can never get back. Do you know what happened to that necklace? I don't. I have no idea who's wearing it now. Something moved behind her eyes, there and gone so fast I almost missed it. Something that might have been guilt if Vera Halden allowed herself to wear guilt where anyone could see it. That's not what today is. No, today you get the whole house instead of 40 acres. That's quite an upgrade in 6 years. "I don't want your house," she said, low and even, each word deliberate. "I have spent my entire career trying to keep families from losing places like Bellamy House to men who see 200 years of history as a line item. I am not your enemy in the way you've decided to remember me, and I would think, after everything, you'd at least credit me with consistency." You've spent your career deciding what other people are allowed to do with what belongs to them, I said. Excuse me if I don't find that comforting, coming from the woman who just got legal authority over my grandmother's silverware. I might have said more, might have gone on peeling back 6 years of resentment layer by layer, right there in the courthouse hallway, while lawyers and clerks filtered past us, pretending not to listen, except my phone buzzed in my coat pocket with an alert from the estate's security system. I almost ignored it, certain it was some minor malfunction, a raccoon setting off a motion sensor in the old carriage house. Then I saw the words, motion detected, study door, enforced open, secured cabinet, and everything else in the corridor went quiet in my head, all the noise of the courthouse fading to a dull hum behind the sudden, cold clarity of fear. Someone's in the house, I said. Vera was already moving, phone to her ear, voice suddenly sharp and businesslike in a way that told me she'd been braced for exactly this kind of complication. By the time I caught up to her in the parking garage, half running in shoes that weren't made for it, she'd confirmed with the monitoring company that whoever it was had already left. Nothing obvious was missing. No jewelry, no artwork, nothing that would show up neatly on an insurance claim for a grieving heiress. They had gone straight for my grandmother's study. They had forced open the locked document cabinet behind her desk, the one Evelyn had always kept secured with a small brass key she wore on a chain around her neck, even in her last months, when she could barely remember what year it was, but never once forgot to check that the key was still there. And one specific ledger, an old cloth-bound accounts book Evelyn had kept separate from everything else in that cabinet, apart even from the estate's other financial records, was gone. I watched Vera's face change when the security company read her the description of the missing book over the phone. It was subtle, a tightening at the corner of her mouth, a stillness that hadn't been there a moment before, but I had spent 30 years learning to read the smallest signals from people who didn't want to be read, and I knew instantly, with a certainty that made my stomach drop, that she recognized that ledger. You know what was in it, I said. We need to go back to the house. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you standing in a parking garage. She was already unlocking a dark green Land Rover that looked older than mine and considerably better maintained, the kind of vehicle that had clearly been chosen for utility rather than image. Get in. I'll explain what I can on the drive. I almost refused on principle, out of pure stubbornness, out of the deep unwillingness to let her be the one giving instructions in front of my own house. Then I thought of the study, of the cabinet Evelyn had guarded so carefully, and I got in the car, slamming the door harder than necessary. The drive north took 90 minutes, most of it in a silence broken only by Vera's clipped phone calls to a structural engineer the court had commissioned to inspect the house before I could legally return to sleep there. Bellamy House had stood on the shore of Lake Aldermere for 140 years, long enough to have outlived 3 generations of Bellamy women who loved it more than was probably good for them, long enough for Ivy to have claimed and lost entire sections of stone wall twice over, and long enough, apparently, for its old bones to hide more damage than any of us had known was possible. The engineer's preliminary report came through while we were still an hour out, the details read to Vera in a steady, professional voice I could half hear through the phone's speaker. Carbon monoxide contamination in the west residential wing, the wing where I had been sleeping since Evelyn's funeral, in the room that had once been my mother's. Electrical damage consistent with deliberate tampering with the old boiler system. Not the natural failure of decades-old equipment, but something colder and more intentional. The bedrooms were unsafe to occupy until repairs were completed. Full stop. No exceptions the engineer was willing to sign his name to. Someone doesn't want you in that house, Vera said, reading the full report over my shoulder at a red light while I drove the last stretch, because her phone wouldn't stop ringing with follow-up questions from the court officer, from the engineer, from a locksmith she'd apparently already summoned before I'd finished processing the sentence. Or someone doesn't want anyone finding what's in that house. Both things can be true. By the time we reached the gates, sleet had started to fall, fine and slanting, coating the gravel drive in a thin gray sheen that caught what was left of the daylight. Bellamy House rose up out of the dusk the way it always did, all gray stone and steep slate roofs and dark windows, beautiful and cold, gothic in the way only a house that had genuinely seen too much grief could be. And for the first time in my life, I looked at it and felt something close to fear instead of homesickness. It looked, in that light, less like a home and more like a question no one had yet answered honestly. Vera parked and turned off the engine and didn't get out right away, her hands still on the wheel as though she were arranging her words before she spent them. "You can't sleep here tonight." The engineer was clear, and the cottages won't have water until at least tomorrow afternoon. The pipes froze sometime over the weekend and no one caught it in time. "I'll figure something out. I always do. I own a house on the northern edge of the property, the old groundskeeper's residence. I restored it years ago, back when I was first working with your grandmother." She said it the way she might report a fact about the weather, careful and neutral. "It's inside the court's security perimeter, which matters, because someone just broke into a locked cabinet 6 hours after a judge announced my custodianship, and I don't think that's a coincidence." "You're staying with me." I laughed, short and disbelieving, the sound cracking oddly in the cold air. "You just won temporary custody of my house. You do not also get custody of me." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." For the first time since the courthouse, something like real irritation crossed her face, a flash of heat under all that composure. "It's not an order, Iris. You can go to a hotel. The nearest one is 50 minutes away in this weather, and I'd worry about you driving it. You can call a friend, if you have one nearby who could take you in tonight. You can sleep in your car in the driveway for all I care, though I'd advise against it in this temperature. I'm telling you what's available, not what you're required to do." "How generous!" "The cottage has a separate guest suite with its own door to the hallway. You would control the lock. I would not enter without your permission, and if you'd feel safer with a signed agreement to that effect, I will draft one right now on the hood of this car, and we can both sign it in the sleet." Her voice hadn't risen at all, but there was something almost raw underneath the flatness of it, an old, careful restraint that I recognized because I used the same one myself when I was trying very hard not to feel something. "If the answer is no, I will arrange something else for you tonight, whatever that takes. But I would like you inside somewhere warm before this turns to ice, and I would like to be able to reach you quickly if that ledger surfaces, or if whoever did this comes back." I stood in the sleet, looking up at the house that held every ghost I had, and I thought about how much I hated the idea of being driven off my own land by anyone, including circumstances entirely outside either of our control. I was not going to let Vera Halden decide where I slept, not after everything. But I also was not going to let her, or a broken boiler, or some faceless thief, push me an hour away from Bellamy land in the middle of the worst week of my adult life. "Fine," I said, "but I'm timing how long you keep your promise about the door." I would expect nothing less from you. She didn't try to carry my bag for me, didn't reach for the door handle before I did, didn't do any of the small proprietary gestures I half expected from an alpha who'd just won legal authority over everything I owned. She simply led the way up the porch steps and let me decide, at my own pace, whether to follow her inside. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. Vera's cottage was nothing like I expected. I had built an image of her private life out of 6 years of courtroom appearances and legal letters typed on heavy trust letterhead, and I had pictured something severe, all glass and steel and silence. A place with nothing in it that couldn't be defended in a deposition. Instead, I found a low stone house with warm light spilling from the windows onto the sleet, a wood stove already ticking with heat in the front room, shelves crowded floor to ceiling with preservation law texts, and rolled architectural plans and a truly excessive number of maps, some of them clearly decades old and lovingly retaped along their creases. There was a kitchen clearly built by someone who thought of meals as logistics rather than pleasure, all clean surfaces and labeled glass containers. But tucked into the corner of the counter, out of place among the order, was a chipped ceramic fox, clumsily glazed in a lopsided orange, that looked entirely handmade by a child. My niece, Vera said, following my eyes without my having to ask. She was 8 when she made it, insisted on giving it to me for my birthday instead of a card. She's 12 now, and considerably better at pottery, though I'll admit, I've grown attached to the fox exactly as it is. I hadn't expected the small, unguarded warmth in her voice when she said it, and I filed the moment away, unwillingly, in the growing collection of things about Vera Halden that didn't match the version of her I'd carried around in my chest for 6 years. The guest suite she showed me had its own door to the hallway, and, more importantly, its own lock, which she demonstrated by handing me the only key without comment or ceremony, then stepped back to let me test it myself, before she even offered to help me find towels. I refused her offer of dinner on principle, ate 2 bites of dry toast alone in the guest room out of stubbornness and exhaustion, and then, an hour later, hunger winning over pride, wandered out in search of anything more substantial, and found Vera at the small kitchen table, with a plate of eggs and toast of her own, a legal file open beside her that she closed the moment she heard my footsteps. I sat down across from her without being invited, and ate half her eggs directly off her plate with my fingers, too tired to bother finding a fork. She watched me do it and said nothing, which was somehow more irritating than if she'd objected, because it meant she'd correctly guessed I hadn't actually eaten anything all day, and had simply chosen not to make it a subject of discussion. "You alphabetize your spices," I said, staring at the neat rack over the stove, cardamom before cinnamon, cinnamon before cumin. "It's efficient. It's deranged. You just straightened 3 picture frames on your way in here, without seeming to notice you were doing it," she said, not looking up from her own plate. "I wouldn't throw stones, Bellamy." I glanced back at the hallway. She was right. I had no memory of touching them, had simply reached out and adjusted each frame the way I'd done in my grandmother's house my entire life, without thought, an old habit worn so deep it had followed me into a stranger's home. Later, when the wood stove's heat and the day's exhaustion had loosened something in my chest, I noticed the particular way the room smelled: bruised bay leaf and cold stone after rain, and something like dried pear wood, threaded through with a faint mineral sweetness I associated, absurdly, with the lake in deep winter. It was Vera's scent, unmistakably alpha, warm and settled and everywhere at once, now that we were under the same roof. And it was doing something to the back of my neck that I did not appreciate at all. A low, unwelcome hum of awareness I hadn't felt in years, not since long before the injunction that broke us apart the first time. "Do you have a neutralizer?" I asked, aiming for casual and missing by a wide margin, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. She didn't make a joke of it, didn't ask why, didn't look wounded by the request the way some alphas would, treating it as rejection. She simply nodded once, businesslike, and by the time I went to bed there was a small diffuser installed in the hallway outside my door, quietly doing its work, filtering the scent down to something faint and manageable, and somehow that mattered to me more than I wanted it to. It was such a small thing. It shouldn't have made my chest ache the way it did. The days that followed did not sort themselves into anything as tidy as a schedule. Time in that house moved the way it moves during a long illness, in strange lurches and long gray stretches punctuated by sudden, sharp moments of clarity. And the investigation into Bellamy House's finances unfolded not across a desk, but across the whole property, room by room, building by building, each one giving up a different piece of the truth in its own time. We started, inevitably, in Evelyn's study, where the forced cabinet still stood open, like a wound no one had bothered to dress. Vera moved through my grandmother's papers with a familiarity that made my stomach clench every time, tracing small pencil marks in the margins of old receipts, a private shorthand Evelyn had apparently used for years, and that Vera, infuriatingly, could read almost as fluently as my grandmother had written it. "She showed you this," I said, watching Vera's finger trace a column of numbers I couldn't decode. "She trusted you with her books before she trusted me with them. She hired the trust 3 years ago, quietly, through a separate account you wouldn't have had reason to see." Vera didn't try to soften it, didn't reach for a gentler version of the truth. She believed that if you knew how bad things had gotten, You would abandon your career and your savings to save the house immediately, without weighing what it would cost you. She was trying to protect you from that decision. That should have been my choice to make, not hers, not yours. I told her that, more than once, in language considerably less patient than I'm using with you now. Vera looked up, and for a moment the careful distance she kept between us wavered. She disagreed. I'm not defending her decision, Iris. I'm telling you the truth, because you deserve it, even 6 years too late to matter as much as it should have. I hated how much that admission cost her to give, the visible effort of it, and I hated more how much I needed to hear it anyway, how it settled something jagged inside my chest even as it opened up new ground to be angry about. We found the first hard evidence of fraud in the abandoned East Wing, sealed off since I was a teenager, after water damage no one had ever properly explained to me, only referenced in passing, the way families reference old wounds they've agreed not to reopen. A restoration invoice on file claimed nearly $500,000 had been spent repairing it over the course of 2 years. When we forced the old door, the hinges shrieking with disuse, and stepped inside with flashlights, we found rotted floorboards, water-stained plaster hanging in curling sheets, and almost no evidence that a single dollar of real work had ever been done in that wing. Someone had pocketed the money and forged the paperwork to prove otherwise, complete with photographs that, on closer inspection later, turned out to have been taken somewhere else entirely. We were 3 rooms in, flashlight beams cutting through decades of undisturbed dust, when I noticed the ceiling above Vera beginning to sag and shouted a warning half a second before it gave way. Vera hauled me backward by the arm as plaster rained down where I'd been standing only a moment before, and we ended up in a heap against the far wall, coughing, covered head to foot in a century of dust, both of us laughing in the shaken, helpless way people laugh when they've just frightened themselves badly and survived it together. It was the first time since the courthouse that I looked at her and didn't feel only anger, and the realization unsettled me more than the falling plaster had. You saw it first, she said, once we'd both caught our breath, brushing dust from her sleeve. You pulled me out of the way. I'd say we're even. I'd say we make a reasonably functional team, for 2 people who spent the drive up here arguing. Don't get used to it. We spent the rest of that afternoon cataloging what remained of the East Wing's furniture, piece by piece, both of us kneeling on the dusty floor with a legal pad between us, and it was there, surrounded by ruined chairs and water-stained portraits of Bellamy ancestors neither of us could name, that I first understood how differently we each saw the same objects. To Vera, everything was evidence. Dates and materials and provenance, the raw data of a fraud case. To me, every scratch and stain was a memory with a face attached to it. My great-aunt's writing desk, my mother's childhood rocking horse missing an ear. She let me talk about each piece before she wrote anything down, never once rushing me toward the next item on her list, and by the time we finished, my throat was raw from talking, and her legal pad was full of details no forensic accountant would have thought to ask for. You didn't have to let me do that, I said, as we packed up in the fading light. I wanted the full record, she said, which was true, and also, I suspected, not the whole reason. The village archive gave us the second thread. An elderly archivist who had known 3 generations of Bellamy women by name pulled land maps for us without being asked twice, her hands trembling slightly with age as she unrolled sheet after sheet across a long reading table, and assumed, based entirely on the volume of our bickering over which document to examine first, that we were a couple. We both denied it far too quickly, in overlapping sentences that only made it worse, and she raised an eyebrow at us over her glasses in a way that made my ears go hot with something I refused to name. What we found in the deed records was more useful than the archivist's opinions of us, though. Several acres listed on Bellamy financial documents as mortgaged collateral against estate debts legally belonged, according to a decades-old community trust filing, to the village itself, and had never been available to pledge as collateral in the first place. Someone had manufactured documents wholesale, banking on the assumption that no one would ever cross-reference the deeds that closely. In the orchard my mother had planted, rows of bare winter trees she'd chosen and arranged herself when I was small enough to ride on her shoulders between them, We found boxes of old records hidden beneath rusted irrigation equipment in a shed I hadn't entered in over a decade. I found my mother's handwriting on a set of planting logs, her looping, impatient script, listing varieties and dates and small private notes to herself about which trees were doing well, and I had to sit down in the frozen grass because my knees stopped working properly, my whole chest gone tight and hollow at once. Vera didn't touch me. She simply sat a careful distance away in the cold, saying nothing, letting me have the moment without trying to manage it. And it was I, eventually, who leaned sideways until my shoulder met hers, needing the solid warmth of another body, more than I needed to be alone with the grief. The conservatory nearly cost us the last of Evelyn's rare winter flowers, a collection of orchids and camellias my grandmother had spent 30 years cultivating, when the heating failed during a hard freeze in the middle of the night. I insisted on helping protect them, several of the plants having come originally from cuttings my mother had brought back from a trip abroad before I was born, and Vera joined me without argument, and we spent hours together, hauling space heaters from across the property, and wrapping stems in old sheets and patching a burst pipe with materials that shouldn't have worked, and somehow, through sheer stubbornness, did. Near dawn, we sat together on the cold tile floor among the dripping glass panes and the surviving blooms, both of us too exhausted to move, and I asked her, in the strange, loose honesty of 4 a.m, why she'd never married. "I nearly fell in love once," she said, watching condensation trail slowly down a nearby pane of glass rather than looking at me, with a woman who seemed determined to hate me. I didn't ask who. I already knew, and something in my chest turned over slowly, painfully, at the admission. A ledger entry, a single line about boathouse repairs that didn't match any invoice we could find elsewhere, sent us across the frozen lake to the old Bellamy boathouse a few days later, and a sudden squall trapped us there until the water calmed enough to risk the crossing back safely. There was one functioning heater, a stack of old wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and lake water, and nowhere to sit that put much distance between us in the small space. I told her not to filter her scent that night, because it was, unexpectedly, calming in a way I hadn't let myself admit I needed, and she checked twice, carefully, that I meant it before she let herself relax under the same blanket beside me. It was there, with the wind hammering the boathouse walls and the lake groaning under new ice, that she gave me the apology she'd owed me for 6 years, not for the injunction itself, which she still maintained had been the right legal call, but for how coldly she'd treated me afterward, for treating my grief over the sale as a legal inconvenience, instead of the genuine loss it had actually been. I didn't forgive her that night, but something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 6 years loosened by a few careful, unwilling degrees. At the village's winter market, held on Bellamy land every year since before I was born, a tradition Evelyn had insisted on maintaining even during the leanest years, I watched Vera quietly resolve an unfair rental dispute for an elderly Omega flower vendor, whose stall fee had been raised without notice, doing it without asking for a fee of her own, and without any of the visible performance of virtue I'd have expected from someone in her position. I understood, watching her, for the first time, that her reputation for ruthlessness was aimed almost entirely at powerful people and institutions, who deserved it, and rarely, if ever, at anyone genuinely vulnerable. When another alpha at the cider stand flirted with me a little too warmly, complimenting my coat in a way that lingered too long on the compliment, Vera's jaw tightened and her shoulders squared in a way she clearly tried, and failed, to hide, and I enjoyed that far more than I should have admitted to myself, filing the small satisfaction away next to all the other things I wasn't ready to examine too closely. Somewhere in those weeks, without either of us announcing it or seeming to decide it on purpose, the shape of our days changed. A scarf of mine appeared over the back of a kitchen chair in Vera's cottage, and simply stayed there, migrating slowly closer to the door each week, as though it were learning the house. My conservation gloves ended up beside her sink, forgotten and then simply left. A mug I favored, plain blue with a chip on the handle, quietly became mine, without either of us ever saying so out loud, set out for me each morning without comment. I noticed she kept my preferred foods stocked without ceremony, restocking quietly whenever we ran low, never mentioning it, never turning it into a gesture that required gratitude. I noticed she couldn't cook anything more complicated than eggs and soup, and never apologized for it, simply handed me the more complicated tasks without discussion, as though our division of labor had always been obvious. She noticed, immediately, entirely too fast for it to be anything but deliberate attention, that I'd repaired her threadbare wool blanket while she was out one afternoon, the one with a dozen careful mends already sewn into it by someone else's hand years before mine, and something in her face when she found it, folded neatly on the end of her bed, told me it had mattered to her more than the stitching itself ever could. One evening, in the middle of that stretch of good weeks, I found her at the kitchen table, with a stack of estate maps spread out in front of her, and a mug of coffee gone cold at her elbow, so absorbed in tracing property lines that she hadn't noticed the hour. I stood in the doorway watching her for longer than I meant to, watching the small furrow between her eyebrows, the way she chewed the end of her pen without seeming to realize it, the careful precision with which she made each note in the margins even when no one was checking her work. It struck me, watching her like that, unguarded and entirely unaware of being watched, that I had spent 6 years hating a version of Vera Halden that had never actually existed, a flattened, simplified villain I'd built out of a single afternoon in a courtroom, and that the real woman sitting at my kitchen table, worrying over century-old property lines because she genuinely cared what happened to them, was infinitely more complicated and infinitely easier to love than the one I'd been carrying around in my chest. "You're staring," she said, without looking up. "I'm allowed to stare. You live here too, apparently, at least as far as my scarf collection is concerned." That got the corner of her mouth to lift, the small, reluctant, almost smile I'd started keeping track of, like a private currency. "Your scarves have colonized the entire coat rack," I checked. Colonized is a strong word for 4 scarves. 5, as of Tuesday. I hadn't realized she was counting, and something about the fact that she was, quietly, without ever mentioning it until I gave her an opening, settled warm and unexpected somewhere under my ribs. We stripped old wallpaper from one of the smaller Bellamy rooms together on a Sunday that had nothing to do with the investigation at all, just an afternoon we'd decided, almost without discussing it, to spend fixing something small and satisfying instead of chasing fraud, and I smeared a streak of wallpaper paste across her cheek out of pure mischief when her back was turned. She looked genuinely, magnificently offended by the entire concept of play, drawing herself up with the same composure she used in a courtroom, and then, with the deliberate calm of a woman plotting a legal strategy, did it back to me, dragging a paste-covered thumb along my jaw with perfect precision. We laughed until the power went out that evening, the old wiring finally giving up under the strain of the space heaters, and we ate cold sandwiches by candlelight in the stripped, half-finished room, and I thought, not for the first time, that I could get dangerously used to this quiet, ordinary happiness. The first real kiss happened on an ordinary evening, after we'd finally repaired the conservatory heating for good and stood back together to admire the steady, even warmth we'd earned through weeks of patchwork fixes, when I learned that Vera had, years earlier, anonymously purchased one of the textiles I'd been forced to sell after the injunction, a piece with my mother's initials worked delicately into the border. My first reaction was fury, an old, familiar accusation rising in my throat before I could stop it, that she was collecting pieces of my family the way she collected old buildings, another acquisition for her careful, controlled world. She let me finish before she explained, quietly, that she hadn't bought it to return it to me dramatically, hadn't even considered it hers emotionally. She'd discovered, through her work, that its new owner intended to cut it apart and sell the fragments piece by piece for a higher combined price, and she couldn't let that happen, professionally or otherwise, regardless of who it had once belonged to. She'd kept it properly stored, climate-controlled, untouched, ever since, and offered, now, to transfer it to me at exactly what she'd originally paid, through whatever legal arrangement made me comfortable. No strings, no expectation of gratitude attached. I saw, all at once, standing in the warm, damp air of the restored conservatory, both her old flaw and her present, deliberate effort not to repeat it, and something in me gave way entirely. "You've wanted me for years," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, She didn't dress it up, didn't soften it with a joke the way she might have once. And wanting you has never given me any claim on you. It still doesn't. I closed the distance between us myself, crossing the tile floor in 3 steps before I could talk myself out of it. She paused, right before her mouth met mine, close enough that I could feel her breath, and asked if I was certain, her voice low and careful even now. I told her, clearly, that I was, and then I kissed her, the way I'd apparently been wanting to for 6 years without ever admitting it, even to myself, her hands coming up slowly to my waist, only after I'd made it obvious I wanted them there, careful and deliberate even in that, and it was, without question, the best decision I'd made in longer than I cared to count. The good weeks that followed were the happiest I'd been since before Evelyn got sick, and then I found the clause. It was buried in the original custodianship agreement, an old emergency preservation provision that gave the active custodian the first legal right to purchase Bellamy House at independent valuation, if the estate were ever declared permanently insolvent. Ahead of any outside buyer, a clause designed decades ago to keep predatory developers from swooping in on failing estates, but which, in this particular case, gave Vera herself a legal path to eventual ownership. Vera had known about it from the beginning. She hadn't told me, not once, in all the weeks we'd spent falling into each other. "You could have owned this house," I said, standing in her own kitchen with the printed clause shaking slightly in my hand, my voice unsteady in a way I hated. "This whole time, while we were doing all of this, you could have ended up owning it outright, and you let me fall for you without ever mentioning that." I didn't disclose it because I believed it would only become relevant if the estate genuinely failed beyond recovery, she said, and to her credit, she didn't try to minimize it or explain it away, just stood there and let the words land as heavily as they deserved to. That was a mistake, and I understand why it feels like more than a mistake to you right now. That was a decision I made unilaterally, again, about what information you were ready to have. That's the entire problem, Vera. That's always been the entire problem. You keep protecting your choices by hiding them from me and calling it care, and I can never tell anymore where the line is between you protecting me and you simply not trusting me enough to let me decide for myself. She didn't argue. She didn't reach for me, didn't offer a defense that might have made it easier for both of us. She just stood there, gray eyes steady on mine, and let the truth of it land, which somehow made it worse, because I couldn't even be angry at her for defending herself when she wasn't defending herself at all. I packed a bag that night with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking and went to stay with my closest friend, Celine, a fellow textile conservator who had never trusted Vera and didn't pretend otherwise now that I'd shown up on her doorstep at 10 o'clock at night, though she was too fair and knew me too well to tell me outright what to do about it. Forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing, she told me over tea at her kitchen table, wrapping both her hands around her mug the way she always did when she was choosing her words with unusual care, and it was exactly as unhelpful and exactly as true as I needed it to be that night. Vera didn't call. She didn't show up uninvited at Celine's door, didn't send flowers or long apologetic letters, didn't do any of the things I half expected and half dreaded. Within 24 hours, though, I learned through a court filing, not from her directly, that she had irrevocably waived the trust's right to purchase Bellamy House under that clause, permanently weakening her own professional and financial position in a way that would follow her career for years, and had asked the presiding judge to appoint an independent co-custodian for any decision touching me personally, on the grounds that our relationship, whatever it currently was, created an unavoidable conflict of interest. She hadn't asked me to come back. She hadn't asked me for anything at all. She'd simply given up the leverage that had come between us, and let the rest, entirely, be my decision to make. I missed her anyway, in small, humiliating ways I hadn't expected. Her terrible coffee, brewed too strong out of pure indifference to the process. Our stupid, circular arguments over the thermostat, which she kept 2 degrees colder than I liked out of some deep-seated belief in the moral superiority of frugality. The particular quiet of her working in the next room, papers shifting, a pen scratching steadily against legal paper. I missed her scent filling the hallway I'd once asked her to filter, and now, absurdly, wished I hadn't ever asked for that distance at all. Missing someone wasn't the same as forgiving her either, so I kept working, because working was the only thing that had ever reliably held me together. Celine watched me pretend the separation didn't hurt for exactly 9 days, before she finally said something about it, setting down her tea with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had been holding her tongue on purpose. "You've reorganized my spice cabinet twice this week," she said. "Alphabetically. You don't even like cooking." I told her it was nothing, that I was simply restless, that the investigation had me thinking in categories. She didn't argue, only raised an eyebrow in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the village archivist, and let the subject drop, though I caught her watching me more closely after that, the way you watch someone recovering from an illness you're not entirely sure has finished running its course. I didn't tell her that the spice cabinet had nothing to do with restlessness, and everything to do with missing a particular kind of order I hadn't known I'd come to depend on until it was 50 minutes away instead of down the hall. I also didn't tell her, because I could barely admit it to myself, that some nights I still reached for my phone to tell Vera something small and pointless, a detail from an old ledger, a joke about a client's terrible taste in curtain fabric, before I remembered, with a small fresh jolt of loss, that I wasn't supposed to be reaching for her at all anymore. My own expertise finally cracked the case wide open, in the end, in a way neither Vera's legal training nor the court's forensic accountants had managed. Studying photographs attached to the fraudulent East Wing invoices late one night at Celine's kitchen table, I recognized dyes visible in the supposed restored textiles pictured in the documentation, dyes that hadn't existed on the estate, hadn't even been manufactured commercially, until years after the invoice dates claimed the work was completed. Someone had recycled old photographs from an entirely different, earlier restoration project to fake work that had never actually happened in the East Wing at all. The forgery led straight back to my cousin Nadine, who had managed the family's legal administration for years, and had always, in every conversation we'd ever had about the future of Bellamy House, urged me gently to sell. Around the same time, working independently, Vera's own investigation uncovered a pattern of payments from a development company called North Glass Heritage Group, flowing steadily into shell accounts controlled by Nadine over the better part of a decade. We reunited, cautiously, over shared evidence rather than apology, sitting across a long archive table like adversaries again, papers spread between us, both of us scrupulously professional, except nothing about the way she looked at me across that table was adversarial anymore, and both of us knew it. "I should have told you before you ever had to discover it," she said again, of the clause, simply, without excuses this time, without any attempt to reframe it as reasonable, and I let myself believe her, finally, because the proof of it was already sitting in a court filing with her name on it. Nadine grew desperate as the walls closed in around her scheme. She used an old debt instrument, one buried deep enough in the estate's paperwork that it had taken weeks even for Vera's team to locate it, to convince a panel of creditors that the estate must liquidate its movable assets immediately, before the 90-day review could conclude and expose the fraud entirely. Within days, an emergency auction had been scheduled, and strangers were walking through Bellamy House with numbered paddles in gloved hands, eyeing my family's paintings and furniture, and, worst of all, the remaining pieces of my mother's textile collection, appraising them, pricing them, treating 140 years of memory as nothing more than a series of line items to be moved efficiently off a balance sheet. Vera had legal grounds to delay the auction, but not, in the time available, enough hard evidence to stop it outright. It was up to me, in the end, to find the rest of what we needed. I remembered a phrase Evelyn used to repeat near the end of her life, in the fog of her illness, textile language she'd borrowed for finances, without ever fully explaining what she meant by it: the wrong side of the cloth. In the old estate chapel, unused for services for decades but never deconsecrated, hung an enormous Bellamy tapestry that had, I realized on my third or fourth visit, recently and subtly been removed from its original frame and rehung slightly askew, the kind of detail no one would notice unless they'd spent their whole life memorizing the exact way that particular chapel looked. Behind its backing wasn't the missing ledger itself, but Evelyn's handwritten index, careful and precise even in her final months, pointing to the original cornerstone archive sealed beneath the chapel floor since the house was first built. I found it. Not Vera, not the court's investigators, not the forensic accountants the trust had hired. Me, on my knees in the cold stone chapel with a flashlight between my teeth, prying up a loose flagstone my own hands remembered from childhood games I'd half forgotten. Inside were the original trust agreements, decades of correspondence, Evelyn's private audit notes written in that same careful shorthand Vera had first taught herself years earlier, copies of Nadine's forged invoices going back nearly 10 years, and proof that Evelyn had suspected something was deeply wrong long before she died, even if she'd never managed to identify the full scope of the scheme before her illness overtook her. There was also, tucked at the very bottom of the small stone chamber, a letter addressed to me alone, my name written in my grandmother's familiar, careful hand. Evelyn apologized, in that letter, for letting Bellamy House become a burden I never chose for myself, for the years of silent expectation she'd placed on my shoulders without ever properly asking whether I wanted to carry them. She told me that inheritance was not an order, that a house, however loved, however old, was never worth more than the woman standing inside it. If saving it meant destroying myself to do it, she wrote, she wanted me, more than anything, to let it go instead. I read that letter twice, sitting on the cold stone floor of the chapel with Vera and Celine, and a court officer standing quietly a respectful distance away, giving me the privacy to fall apart if I needed to, and something in me that had been braced my entire life, every year since my mother died, finally, carefully, allowed itself to relax. I confronted Nadine publicly before the auction could complete, standing in the great hall of Bellamy House itself, surrounded by half the county's antique dealers and 2 local reporters who'd caught wind of the scandal. She didn't deny everything, to her credit, or perhaps simply because there was no longer any point in denying it. She argued, with real, uncomfortable conviction, that every Bellamy woman had sacrificed herself, one after another, to a collapsing pile of stone, my mother, my grandmother, and now me, and that she had only ever wanted to force the family to finally, mercifully, let it die. Some of that's true, I told her, in front of everyone, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. You're not entirely wrong about what this house has cost us, but you didn't free anyone, Nadine. You stole our right to choose, by manufacturing a crisis instead of ever, even once, asking any of us what we actually wanted for ourselves. The documents did the rest of the work that my words alone couldn't do. The court officer suspended the auction on the spot, right there in the Great Hall, and Northglass withdrew from the deal entirely within the week, once the fraudulent lien network became a matter of public record. Nadine's future would be decided by other courts, criminal and civil both, not by me. And I found I had no appetite left for hating her the way I once might have. Confirmed at last as heir, and free of the crushing debts that had nearly buried the estate entirely, I made a decision that surprised almost everyone who thought they knew what preserving Bellamy House was supposed to mean. I didn't simply restore it as a private monument to a family that had already spent generations sacrificing itself for a house. I split its future instead, deliberately, room by room. The grand historic rooms became a public textile and preservation center, open to visitors and students alike. Part of the orchard my mother had planted became protected community land, held in trust the way it should have been years earlier. The old market gardens went back to feeding the village the way they had before the family fortune quietly disappeared. Empty outbuildings became studios for young conservators who couldn't otherwise afford proper training. I kept a smaller residential wing for myself, rather than rattling around alone inside the whole enormous house for the rest of my life, and turned the ruined east wing, finally properly repaired this time, into teaching space instead of a monument to what had been stolen from it. Vera supported the plan without once trying to shape it to her own preferences, without offering the kind of gentle, well-meaning suggestions that would have amounted to steering me anyway. That, more than anything else she could have said or done, told me exactly how much she'd actually changed. We didn't rush back together the day the auction ended. Weeks passed while the court finished transferring full control back to me, and Vera kept a careful, deliberate professional distance the entire time. never once testing the boundaries she'd drawn for herself. On the day her custodianship officially expired, at exactly noon according to the court order, she came to the house herself, in person, and handed me the complete set of keys and financial access credentials without a hint of ceremony, no speech, no dramatic gesture. "My authority over Bellamy House ended at noon," she said. "I checked the clock," I admitted. "I assumed you would." She turned to go, and I stopped her, my hand catching her sleeve before I'd fully decided to reach for her at all. For a long moment, neither of us said anything at all, the two of us standing in the wide stone entryway, with sunlight coming in low and gold through the tall windows, the keys still warm in my palm from her hand. I thought about all the versions of this house I'd loved and resented in equal measure over the years. The child's version, full of my mother's laughter. The teenager's version that felt more like a cage than a home. The grieving woman's version that had nearly buried me, along with everyone I'd lost inside it. I thought about how strange it was that the ending of one custodianship, one legal arrangement that had begun as an insult, had somehow become the beginning of the only kind of custody that ever actually mattered. Two people choosing, freely and repeatedly, to look after each other. I told her what I'd finally understood, in the quiet weeks I'd had to sit with everything, that I had spent years believing independence meant never letting anyone matter enough to hurt me, building walls out of my own stubbornness and calling it strength, and that she had spent years believing protection meant making the hard decisions before anyone else could make dangerous ones, building the exact same walls out of legal precision and calling it responsibility, and that we'd both been wrong, in our own particular, mirrored ways. I told her I would never accept being managed, by her or by anyone else. Not now, not after everything I'd survived to get here. "I don't want to manage you," she said, and her voice, for once, wasn't perfectly steady. "I never did, even when it looked that way from where you were standing." "Then what do you want?" "You," she said, without hesitation, without any of her usual careful qualification. "Not the house, not the name, not any say over what you decide to do with either one of them. Just the chance to build something with you, if you still want the same thing I do." I chose her. Right there, in the doorway of the house that had cost us both so much, I kissed her the way I'd been wanting to for weeks, and this time, neither of us pulled back to ask permission first, because we'd already given it, fully and repeatedly, in every small, ordinary thing we'd done for each other, since the day the boiler failed and neither of us had wanted to admit how much we needed the other one close. We didn't rush the rest of it either. I moved back into Bellamy House, into rooms I chose and arranged for myself this time. No one else's expectations layered over them. She went back to her cottage. We dated properly, for the first time in either of our lives, without a lawsuit or a custodianship or a family crisis forcing us into the same rooms day after day. She had to knock on my door like anyone else now, and I made a point of letting her wait exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary before I opened it, just to watch the small flicker of amusement cross her face every time. I stayed over at her cottage some nights, simply because I wanted to, not because the pipes had frozen, not because there was nowhere else to sleep. We took weekends away from Bellamy Land entirely, somewhere no one knew either of our names or our history. She attended preservation conferences where I stood up in the audience and publicly, cheerfully disagreed with her professional opinions on restoration philosophy, and we went home afterward laughing about it instead of arguing the way we once would have. Slowly, without either of us deciding it on purpose, the cottage where I had once felt trapped by circumstance became a place I associated only with warmth, with the particular quiet of her working in the next room, with a scent I no longer wanted filtered at all. We fought, of course, because two stubborn women who had spent 6 years perfecting the art of disagreeing with each other did not simply stop disagreeing because they'd fallen in love. We fought about the pace of restoration work in the new teaching studios, about whether the market garden needed a second greenhouse or a better irrigation system first, about whether her habit of reading contracts at the dinner table counted as working through a meal or merely as ignoring me with excellent posture. But the fights themselves had changed shape entirely. We no longer fought to prove the other one wrong. We fought, mostly, because we both cared enormously about the same things and had different, equally stubborn ideas about how to protect them. And somewhere in the middle of every argument, one of us would eventually laugh, and the other would follow, and we'd end up finishing the conversation with our heads bent together over the same set of plans, both a little embarrassed at how invested we'd gotten over greenhouse placement. Celine, watching this new version of us across a dinner table one evening, finally admitted, grudgingly, that she'd been wrong about at least one thing. "I still don't fully trust her," she said, refilling my glass. "But I trust the way she looks at you." That's different. It was, I thought. It was entirely different. The difference between a woman who had once decided things on my behalf, out of fear of losing what mattered, and a woman who now, deliberately, every single day, chose to ask instead. Almost a year after the day the judge said her name, and my whole life tilted sideways in that courtroom, Bellamy House had begun its second life. The public textile center had opened its doors to visitors from 3 counties over. The orchard was heavy with fruit again, the trees my mother had planted finally, fully thriving under proper care. Young apprentices worked in rooms my family had kept locked for decades, learning skills I'd once thought I'd have to guard entirely alone. Visitors moved freely through spaces that had once been closed off to anyone outside the family, closed off to grief and secrecy both, and the house felt alive in a way I hadn't known it could, instead of merely preserved, embalmed, kept as a monument to the dead. I kept my own conservation practice, growing rather than shrinking under the weight of everything else, and I was never, in anyone's eyes, including my own, simply reduced to being Vera's partner. She kept her legal work, her reputation for being formidable, still fully intact in professional rooms across the county, even as she'd become, at home, someone entirely capable of losing an argument about wallpaper paste with obvious, unguarded good humor. The public opening of the textile center, the week before that spring celebration, drew more people than I'd expected, conservators and curious neighbors, and a few reporters who'd followed the Nadine story to its conclusion, and wanted to see what had become of the house at the center of it. I stood in the doorway of what had once been my grandmother's formal drawing room, now lined with careful glass cases displaying pieces of the Bellamy textile collection alongside informational placards written in my own hand, and watched strangers move slowly through a space that had spent most of my life closed to anyone outside the family. An old woman from the village, one of the vendors from the winter market, stopped in front of my mother's recovered tapestry fragment for a long time, then turned to me with tears standing openly in her eyes, and told me she remembered my mother hanging washing in the orchard when she herself was a girl. I hadn't expected the opening of a preservation center to feel like grief and celebration at once, but it did, and Vera, standing quietly at my elbow the entire afternoon, never once tried to hurry me past the moments that needed longer than a moment. On a warm evening in spring, after the last guests from the estate's seasonal celebration had gone home, and the lanterns strung through the courtyard had begun to gutter low, Vera and I walked together through the orchard, our hands loosely linked, no particular destination in mind. The same trees that had looked half dead the winter we'd searched them for hidden records were heavy with blossom now, the air thick with that particular sweetness that only comes once a year, briefly, before it's gone again. "My guest room's been empty for months," Vera said, with the careful, deliberate casualness she used whenever something actually mattered to her more than she wanted to admit out loud. "You haven't used it in a while." "I've been thinking about a change," I said. She went very still beside me, the way she always did before she let herself hope for something too much, and I loved her too much by then to make her wait long for the rest of it. I took a small brass key from my pocket, one I'd had cut weeks earlier and carried with me ever since, waiting for the right evening. Not to Bellamy House. She already had every right to walk through those doors whenever she wanted, key or no key. But to the private residence I'd finished renovating in the smaller wing, the rooms that were entirely mine to give away. "Do you want to live here with me?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, and when she did, it was with the same careful question she'd learned to ask me, about everything that mattered, every single time, ever since the night I'd told her exactly what her silence had cost me. "Are you sure?" I laughed, the sound bright and easy in the warm spring air. Because of course she asked that now, every single time it counted, the way she never had when it would have mattered most, 6 years ago, and the way she always did now, without fail, when the stakes were nothing but our own 2 lives. Yes, I said, I'm sure. The first time I ever stayed under her roof, it was because a broken boiler had left me nowhere else on the estate to sleep, and neither of us had wanted it, had chosen it, had done anything but accept it as the least bad option available in a bad situation. The night she finally moved into mine, every door between our 2 lives stood open, unlocked, unguarded, and we walked through them together because, for once, nobody had decided anything for either of us. We had simply chosen, freely, deliberately, after everything we had both survived, to reach this particular evening, the same home, the same orchard in bloom, the same quiet, unremarkable, entirely ordinary life neither of us had ever quite believed we were allowed to want.